Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The gates of hell are open night and day. Smooth the descent, and easy is the way. But to return and view the cheerful skies, in this the task and mighty labor lies. Virgil, 70 to 19 BC. Never did I feel more cast down this dark period of my life. Why did I come wailing but for my destruction? I think my damnation is fixed now. Captain Clothier Pierce, Minnesota Logbook, 1868. Chapter 1. Mors tua vita mi. I am sitting on a rock alone, the last survivor. Everyone else is dead. Slow-moving waves of emerald and turquoise swirl in the lidless black sky above me. I am sitting here, looking up at that haunting green luminescence, the place from which we all must have surely descended. The Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights. I'd like to believe that's true. The building blocks of the cosmos, yet strangely spiritual, and easily able to make man dream that there is something watching above us all. Its presence is somehow familiar in the desolate hollows of our reality. It appears to me now like drawing curtains to reveal the beyond world of everlasting emptiness. Will it ever forgive us for what we have done here? I am on an island somewhere in the Barents Sea. I will never leave its rugged shores. I know I am destined to die here alone, at the world's edge. All around me is lurid, decaying wilderness. Nothing but snow, fog, and rocks. This grim reminder of our own fragile mortality. The eternal darkness of the afterlife is all that awaits me now. I can see it. Headlong into hell, and I am soon to join the others. How did I get here? Why did I come here? The worst part of my damnation is I do not have an answer to those questions. All I know is I came here on the SS Glenmore, a whaling ship sailing out of Scotland. Our damned voyage sailed from Aberdeen port with a crew of 30 on November 11th in the year 1869. What came after was our own perdition. It was Friday we set sail. We were heading north to the Norwegian Sea on a skirmish to hunt northerly whales for their oils, whose applications may have said propelled our evolution into this industrial age. I guess I felt different about it all. I remember seeing this ship for the first time, harbored in Aberdeen port on that fateful morning in November, long ago. The moment I saw it there, set against the backdrop of the milky morning mist, I felt my stomach involuntarily contract. I should have turned around that instant and left for Boston, but I didn't. The SS Glenmore was one of those sickly old harpooner whaling ships that somehow appeared nowhere near its vicious life's sunset. It instead took on an air of immortality about it, a lean and hungry vessel with an insatiable desire to fill its holds with the bloodied whale meat. It had been used almost constantly since its construction in the year 1828. It was a long and narrow sail ship, like a shark, with a total length of 34 meters. The traditional sail plan of the bark gave it extra speed. In London, the ship was conceived in Green, Wigrams, and Green at Blackwell Yard, a place that seems like worlds away now as I write this. The creaking keel was painted with a loathsome dark green, the hull covered in thick, black tar-like paint. As I approached the ship, I could smell this stench that seemed to radiate from its rank underside constantly. It smelled like death. The gangways were all laden with crude meat hooks and dulled harpoons, like dried-out corpses hung from the ropes. I reluctantly stepped onto the deck with a shudder and was greeted by a series of grunts and smirks from the crew. The blur of their grayed jackets, dirtied flat caps, and matted beards swam by me as I moved down the ship's length towards the captain's deck. Being the only American on board, I immediately felt uncomfortable and out of place as I clutched my luggage and shuffled through them, all bearing down on me. As I moved down the deck, merely to avoid making eye contact with any of them, something else caught my eye. I had peered overboard and saw a small old lady looking up at me from the edge of the docks. She was wearing a black dress and a frilled bonnet. She glared at me, shook her head, and gestured the cross of Christ across her body. It was hard to tell exactly, but I thought I saw her whisper something as she did. "Forgive us our sins," I mouthed back at her, but she did not retort. Instead, she just stared up at me with a blistering hatred. I looked away. For some reason, the gesture really bothered me. It seemed she knew something about the voyage that I did not. She gripped that cross tight against her chest like it was a shield against us all. I looked away from her and tried to pull it all out of my mind. I was commissioned on the ship as its doctor and surgeon. I had performed this duty several times before, but usually on cruise liners and much more glamorous steamboats. It was my duty to be in charge of the medicine cabinet, and to do that, I needed to get situated. "Captain MacPhail? I believe he is to show me my quarters?" I asked one of the gnarled foremast hands. He said no words and instead pointed up the length of the deck. I followed his fingers with my gaze and then saw the captain. He was standing at the wheel puffing on his pipe. Captain MacPhail looked down and acknowledged me with a big, menacing grin. He then came down from the quarterdeck to welcome me. I did not feel welcome, however. He was a weathered old Scottish seafarer with a shock of white hair and a thick, heavy mustache. He must have been about 50. A great stocky man with thick legs and a wide chin. Tough bastard. "Welcome, Doctor," he said with a big grin as he patted me hard on the shoulder. The impact shook my ribcage. "We're 10 minutes to cast off. Let's get you settled." He took hold of me and practically dragged me down to my quarters. I had never set eyes on a whaling vessel before, let alone stepped upon one. But since touching the wooden handrails of the thing, I knew I hated the ship. It seemed evil, like it was some kind of vampiric entity. Something about the old woman in black really made my skin quiver also. Unfortunately, I was desperate for money. My addictions had spiraled out of my grasp. I had lost my favor with many reputable employers in London and Boston. This disgusting floating hulk was my last chance at a surgeon's wage. I almost had to close my eyes as I was led down into the bowels of the beast. It smelled like old bilge water and blood down there, salts and mold, flesh and death. The smell turned my stomach. Rats scurried around in the guttering, and the decks were all black and slippery. After I was shown my quarters, the meager little room with only a slatted wooden door for privacy, I sat down alone on the edge of the bed and dripped a few drops of raw laudanum into my tongue to ease my anxiety. All I could think was, what in God's name am I doing here? Soon after, up on deck, the mooring ropes were loosened. We drifted away from the port into a dense enveloping cloud of fog. I looked out of my lonely little porthole and watched the last of those civilized lands disappearing behind me into a gray. A young lad of about 15 came up and knocked and asked if I required anything. Simmons was his name, and he was the cabin boy. I told him I had everything I needed, even though that was a lie. The expedition was scheduled for 2 months, and that fact made my heart sink low into my stomach. I sighed and mixed one more dose of the devil laudanum to quell my shaking hands. The ship strode on through the perpetual waves, and, peering out of the porthole, I suddenly felt vaguely scared at its hegemony. Out there, the sea seemed to stretch off endlessly in every direction. Boundless, bare, dark waves. Chapter 2. Video at Teseo. The days had drifted by listlessly. I sought to keep myself occupied aboard the floating husk in any way I could. I'd installed myself in my books at every opportunity, studying Latin and reading about Roman philosophers. After taking a brief inventory of my supplies, I calculated that with strict but tactical rationing, I could induce a semi-conscious state for over 2 months by using the laudanum, effectively rendering me functional but absent of mind. This could offer me at least some sort of reprieve until we docked in civilized lands once more. I had only learned a few names since being aboard. They were those who bothered to speak to me. There was Harper, the idler or cook, Cartwright, who was one of the harpooners, Edwards, the first mate, Simmons, the sheepish cabin boy, and Chamberlain, who was the other primary harpooner. The rest of the foremast men and crew did not speak to me, so I kept to myself and moved away from their presence wherever I could. On a small ship, however, it was proving difficult. Whenever the men were in the forecastle eating their dinner, I would stay up on deck alone, and vice versa. I had never felt so alone before. I hated the ship. I hated the men, too. They were savage and selfish men. I could see it in their eyes. Driven only by pure greed, they did not care for each other, nor the world, not even themselves. I felt like a lone cat amongst a pack of rabid dogs. I remained up on deck by myself one night, having offered to take the last watch after the sails were furled and heaved to overnight. Up on the bow, I watched the dying sun fall below the world's rim. It was a dark night. The stars above struggled to twinkle against the brooding blackness. Choppy waters lapped against the bilge, and the ship squirmed. Everything was quiet and repeating. And I stood there thinking about all the places I could have been rather than aboard that dreaded ship. Why did I come here? I believe my damnation is set. We were 8 days into our voyage when I first felt the darkness. Since boarding, I had this ill-twisted feeling in my stomach that something terrible would happen, yet I couldn't say what exactly. There was just something different in the air. Something since seeing that old lady at the docks. Perhaps I imagined it, but everything felt unusual. I could not shake this feeling that clung to me like cold mud. There was a presence, a darkness that seemed to be following the ship. Now and then I'd turn over my shoulder to try and spy it out there on the waters, but there was nothing behind us. There was nothing there. For some reason, I imagined a great ancient squid-like entity swimming just off the rudder, pursuing us. Yet, nothing was there. Nothing but that unmistakable feeling of darkness. I shook my head. Perhaps the laudanum was having more of an effect on me than I'd first thought. Each day, I'd taken more and more of the drug to cinder the anxiety overtaking me. The weather throughout the days was intermittently gray and bleak. The nights were long and inky thick. As the nervousness in my stomach matured, I soon began to wonder if the seas and the winds were somehow working in unison against us. There was just something rotten with this whole voyage. It was the 13th day at sea. All was quiet. There appeared to be a storm brewing off on the horizon, but it was a long way north from the ship. We had not seen a whale yet, and the crew was getting bored and anxious. The foremast hands were swabbing the deck, and the idlers were preparing the dinner out of the hardtack and salted pork. I had been reading for most of the morning, and the crew's commotion about me had barely entered my peripheries. All of it vague echoes of the ambience of the waves. Then I heard something that brought me back to my reality.
"Whale, Captain!"
Chamberlain, the harpooner, had shouted, breaking the tranquility. With the call, the men cheered. Edwards, the first mate, bellowed,
"All hands! All hands on deck!"
Everyone sprung into motion and prepared their tools. I had never seen a whale before, and I knew I had to do so. More curious than anything, I put my book down and headed to the front of the boat. The busying crew all shuffled around me as I glided to a better vantage point. And there I saw it. A whale. She was more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. She was magnificent. A great gray thing with mottled specks of white algae all over it. From the bow of the ship, I watched the 15-meter-long sperm whale swim through the pallid blue thralls. It moved through the waves effortlessly, fantastically, as if it were indeed a part of the waves or resting upon them. Its giant tail fin rising out of the swells and splashed the salty sea spray up to my face. I laughed gleefully. "She's beautiful!" I screamed, but heard no response. Then, filtering through the sound, the rushing waves and the roar of the sails, I heard the feral bays and cheers of the crew behind me. One of the foremast hands swung from the sail ropes like some deranged gibbon at the side of the whale. The crew all prepared their harpoons and cheered and banged the boat's sides at the thrill of the pursuit. I suddenly felt a thick, heavy stone turn over in my stomach. How could I have been so stupid? As Captain McPhail commanded the wheel, he looked down at me hanging from the railings, studying me as I sighed with grief. He knew I did not condone this. "You've got her now, Doctor," he snarled to me excitedly. But I could do no such thing. Naive awe was soon replaced with crushing guilt. The chase was on. I could look on helplessly as the SS Glenmore closed the gap and came alongside the whale. We chased her for at least an hour. No, we don't have to do this. We should let it go, I thought, over and over. Then the rowboats went out, full of harpooning teams from the ship. They prepared the ropes and negotiated the slack before positioning the harpoons. I watched the whole thing from the spyglass, hoping that something would go wrong and the whale would escape. The boats surrounded her. She had nowhere to go. I was soon locked in a dull paralysis, silently pleading to something, anything, for the whale to dive far down away from the range of their harpoons. But it didn't. It was blissfully unaware of what was about to happen.
Dive, you fool!
I shouted at the beast.
Swim down! Please! Dive! Dive!
It was too late for the whale. The harpoon let loose from Cartwright's grip and screeched banshee-like into the mist. The razor tip plunged into the whale just behind its right flipper, and it screamed. It rolled over.
No!
I bellowed. I didn't know whales could scream. The noise sounded like a trumpeting, groaning elephant. My skin went cold, and I shuddered at hearing it. Another harpoon found its way to the whale's stomach. It howled and rolled onto its side further in the waves. The waters ran red. Pools of crimson swirled around its lacerated body, the pouring torment merging in with the frothy blackness of the Norwegian Sea. The crew shouted and swore gleefully at each other as it did. The whale tried to swim away, but it couldn't. They had her bound. I sunk to my knees, clinging the rail, unable to look on anymore. With the harpoons, they were able to snare and reel her in. Now it was a matter of attrition. The whale would run out of oxygen and have no choice but to surface again. After another half-hour battle, it did. The captain looked down at me and bellowed joyfully.
Your girl's got some fight in her yet.
I didn't respond. I could not bear to look upon any of it. If I were not so weak and passive, I would have liked to have stabbed Captain McPhail to death at that moment, right in his fucking eyeball with a rusty blade. The hate swelled up in me like a stomach full of burning coals. I would have liked to have killed them all. The rabid dogs that were the crew's ranks. I could hear that animal cry and beg in agony from over my shoulder. It was a kind of sobbing yelp that carried across the waters. It turned my heart heavy, and I could no longer bear it. The men's eyes glowed unnaturally with bloodlust all around me. There were demons aboard. What we were doing out there made me disgusted to call myself human. Something welled up unannounced inside of me, a fit of searing anger. I could not stop the words from coming out. Flashes of the old lady at the docks ran through my mind. Forgive us for what we have done here.
Oh, God! Curse you! Curse all of us!
I bellowed.
Why are we doing this? This is not right. Death to all of us. May we be lost at sea, the earth, and time itself. May no one ever speak our names again for what we have done here. Curse us all! Curse us all to hell forever!
The men simply laughed and chided me as they continued with their work. But Captain MacPhail only watched on curiously at my tirade. I threw the spyglass to the deck in outrage.
Death to us all!
I bellowed. They all laughed. I ran off and went down and sulked in a decrepit little corner of the horrible ship. By this point, the storm that we saw earlier had started to come in hard and heavy. The downpour was tremendous. We had sailed right into it as we hunted the whale, and no one had noticed. The savage crew set to work on reeling the giant in and had no choice but to continue working in the gales and the rains. As they tugged the whale's corpse closer, I looked down over the side at its lacerated body. There in the reddened water, it was still alive. I could see it in the beast's eyes. I could only hope that the animal was so shocked that it could not feel anything anymore at this point. Cartwright and the rest of the crew eventually heaved the whale up to the railings and held her in place with giant rusted black mate hooks. It was barbaric. Then they began slicing and cutting and hacking away through the whale's blubber, mocking her body. The crew butchered the whale bit by bit in the unrelenting rain like demons feasting in the deepest pits of hell. They drew slabs of blubber off its back and laid them on the deck. That was all they wanted. Plumes of sickly black smoke drifted up from the forecastle and into the rain as the idlers prepared to try the whale. They had started the furnace to boil the blubber down into the oil. Oil lamps flickered in the gloom. The crew's faces glowed against the dull flames. I stood there amongst them and felt truly miserable. I had the overwhelming urge to cast myself overboard for my sins. But something else began to happen. A strong gust of wind came in from the north, the worst one yet. It suddenly rocked and sent the ship spinning around uncontrollably. Then another gale. Then another. The storm had swelled into something monstrous all around us. Slowly, the winds battered the ship. This went on for at least another hour. I got up from my corner and attempted to come to the middle of the boat, swaying from side to side. Once there, I was greeted by a wall of freezing rain from the starboard side, icy and impenetrable like death itself. Something was very wrong now. The skies were darker than ever. The churning black clouds above blotted out what little sun there was. I shielded my eyes with my hand outstretched and tried to grab onto something. The SS Glenmore then began swirling around slowly, as if it was stuck in a whirlpool. The men appeared panicked, and I could see why. The ship's gantry squirmed as it took the full brunt of the whale's weight in the gales. Ragged ropes were pulled taut, and everything aboard the ship was tense and coiled. Everyone was shouting and screaming around me. Their noise was a blur in the howling winds. I saw that 2 foremast men were hanging by one arm each from the forepeak and trying to signal up to Captain MacPhail. They were waving and gesturing to the whale's lifeless, bloodied husk. At first, I was unable to see what the problem was. I looked up to Captain MacPhail to gauge some sort of understanding of the situation. But then, the ship suddenly groaned against the storm, and it felt like the wood of the masts was bowing. I instinctively clasped hold of the nearest rail available. The fierce wind combined with the off-balanced bulk of the sperm whale was straining the vessel's struts to its limits. Rain splashed into my face as I tried to look up. At this point, I thought I heard someone say,
"She's an anchor! She's dragging us down!"
Then abruptly, the lines from the gantry all snapped, and the sperm whale began to fall away from the vessel's side. The crew squawked and barked as they tried to take hold of the frayed ropes to stop their prize from falling away, but it was too late. The animal weighed too much to be held. "Down!" Someone then screamed from behind me, so I jumped to the floor instinctively. All the crew also hit the deck with the command, save for one. There was this thunderous clap of ripping rope and snapping wood, something breaking and giving way. One of the meat hooks of the broken gantry had broken off. As we all lay there on the deck, it cut down the flanks like a guillotine. The hook then swang around right into one of the men who'd failed to hit the deck. It took him in the forehead with a vicious crunch, snagging him under. And everything about the hull was yanked down into deep, inky waves teeming with white foam. The whale's carcass sunk to the depths of the tempest along with the seamen, both swallowed up by infinite waters. The crew all peered over the side, staring down into the brooding sea in horror, into the black gulfs where their crewmate and whale once were. Aligning with their deaths, the storm roared above. That was when I knew we were a cursed expedition. That was when I knew the old lady was right. Chapter 3. Mors Omnibus. After the funeral at sea, the men retreated down into the ship's bowels to drink and forget about the day's hardships. The dead seaman's name was never mentioned again. The storm had gotten worse. It grew monstrously since the accident, and the whole ship heaved itself reluctantly through the dark-veined waves and beating rains. Almost 50 nautical miles away from where the seamen died, it was clear that the weather seemed to be following us now. Down in the orlops, as I navigated the dim, swaying hallways alone, I could hear the low, feeble sea shanties coming from them all. They laid in their hammocks and drank and sang like a pack of yapping dogs. Captain MacPhail had invited me to his cabin that night, presumably so I could explain my actions earlier in the day. All I could think of was perhaps they were right. It was bad luck to curse a voyage. The men hated me now. They blamed me for it all. I could see it in the twinkle of their eyes. I had wanted to avoid them wherever possible, so his invitation was begrudgingly welcomed. I came to his door, and he let me in without so much as a word. A couple hours of drinking had passed. Edwards had left us. It was just Captain MacPhail and me. His cabin was dark and cold, despite the wood burner roaring away. The wood-cladding walls held various oil paintings of seafarers and mythical monsters of the deep. Leviathan, kraken, squids of the twilight, sharks of extreme lengths. A collection of dusty old tomes was on his desk that had clearly never been read. Captain MacPhail had installed himself in front of his fire, shrouded in gloom, and did his best to appear glum for most of the night. But I could tell he didn't care for the dead man. He only cared for the payments he had lost. In front of me, I merely assumed it was an attempt to show appropriate sorrow and humility at the death of a seaman.
He was a popular lad. The men will take it hard,
he said to me without looking at me.
Sure ne'er happened. Someone failed to strap something down correctly.
I think it was the storm, I replied after a long silence. He cocked his head and looked at me.
This is no storm, Doctor,
he snapped.
I've sailed and slept through much worse. Force 7 at most. I know these seas.
For now, it is, but it's getting worse. You have to admit that.
You a meteorologist or a surgeon?
He stood up from his chair and headed over to the bar.
Come, have another drink with me.
He pushed. He was trying to loosen my lips, that much was clear. But he also needed no excuse to drink. Captain McPhail had the same ailment as me. The only difference was his addiction of choice was alcohol. Nothing put a smile on his face like half a bottle of whiskey. Without it, he was prone to bouts of melancholia. As the day went on and his hangover faded, it was always slowly replaced by those unmistakable, glazed-over eyes of defeat, only retreating to his cabin at night and drinking until he forgot everything ever brought him a sense of joy. "No, thank you. I must get some sleep," I said, desperate to leave.
Scotch, was it?
He asked brazenly as he poured me a tumbler full of it.
Or perhaps you would prefer it mixed with laudanum? That'll help you escape, won't it?
He chuckled. He then sauntered over to me with an air of shrewd wisdom and placed the glass in my hands. I glumly looked down at the brown liquid whirling around in the cold tumbler. The ship was now swaying and groaning against the threnody of steep and squalling waves, banking from port to starboard. Bitter gales rumbled and rain hammered against the windows harder than ever before. However, the room was near quiet, save for the odd crackling of firewood.
It's the Macallan 1840, Doctor. After a very long silence,
"It'll be a crime to waste it," McPhail said, watching me grimace at the tumbler. I shook my head, unable to look at anything but the whiskey, responding to the waves outside, thinking about what could be swimming down there, following the ship. Some obscene entity not yet known to the modern world. At some point, its slippery black tentacles would settle over the ship's bow and drag us all down into the depths to join the dead whale. It had answered my curse. All I could think about was getting back home. "I think we should turn around and head back to Aberdeen, Captain McPhail."
you'd like that, wouldn't you?
He scoffed. It was tradition for the captain and the higher-ranking members of the ship to exchange war stories and laugh in front of the fire after a hard day's work. But not tonight. Tonight, he had wanted to interrogate me and decide what to do with me from there. A lot of accidents can happen aboard these voyages. Some were more explainable than others. People go missing on these trips all the time. "The storm is only going to get worse. This is wrong. I can feel it," I said. His eyes scanned me mercilessly. He was searching, excavating for a reason to kill me.
We've only acquired a quarter of the whale after today's events. That barely covers the cost of the voyage, let alone the men's wages. If we were to turn back now, we would stand to lose everything. The men would find another vessel the second we're back at port. The ship would ne'er sail again. Unacceptable. We must keep going until that hold is full of blubber. Now, have a drink.
I could do no such thing, however. I simply shook my head again. "I'm beginning to think this voyage is cursed," I muttered, almost embarrassed at how it sounded coming out. Yet I could not stop thinking about that presence. "There's something wrong here. I don't want to disrupt your skirmish, but there's something following the ship. There's a darkness here. You must acknowledge it. We should cut our losses and sail back now, because this is not right." He leaned forward and scowled at me. "What are you even doing on this ship?" You have no business being here. I've been asking myself that a lot these past few days. We should not be here, I said, holding my cross in my hand. Captain McPhail noticed.
You think that cross will save you? A flimsy bit of metal?
He chided.
Suppose you'd be off to some theatre now, sipping wine with other members of high society, he scoffed. The perfume on your favourite woman's neck, the candles in your smoking rooms, the buttons on her fancy corset, all come from the whale. It's time you realised how essential this trade is, Doctor,
the captain then stated while using his glass to demonstrate his point. I'm not here to debate ethics with you. Of course, it is not essential to our survival. He turned and looked at me and smiled wryly.
You don't agree with what we do you?
His teeth were sharp and white. They made me grimace. That's putting it mildly.
Ha!
Well, like it or not, you're here. And you chose to be here. Only about 300 miles of raw open ocean stopping you from being home now. But don't let that bother you. Things will be better tomorrow, you'll see. Storms always pass, he said, and smiled at me again with a veneer of malice. From that moment, I knew my time aboard the ship was borrowed. Someone intended to kill me. It was signed and affirmed. I didn't say anything else. Silence fell over the cabin like a suffocating cloud. Captain McPhail turned away. His face hardened, and he appeared to be grimacing at what I had said now. He then resigned himself to staring vacantly into the rolling flames.
The things I've seen and done out here. God, the things I've done. I've jousted with mighty Poseidon himself. And I'll do it all again.
He then looked up at me. His eyes were hollow and dark, like two glistening black orbs of granite on an endless beach.
The seas are cruel foes, he said.
You're right, Doctor. There is something following this ship. Evil. And I've felt it my entire life. This darkness. It's below. It's like we've sailed off into something else. Must be contended with. Not surrendered to. There are black waters out there, and something is down there in it. Pure evil is swimming around in the depths. And you brought it upon us with your curses today. Bad luck to curse a voyage, boy. What will you do then? I didn't reply. Instead, the storm outside seemed to answer for me. The SS Glenmore lurched and staggered through the troughs and crests of the steep waves. Every bank, heave, and raindrop only reminded me that I could have been anywhere, but instead, I was there, on a floating coffin in the middle of the ocean. As I stood there looking at him, a roaring jolt of lightning illuminated the cabin for a split second. And there, in that space within the flash, I believe I saw Captain McPhail, headless and dead, sitting there in his chair before me, his posture somehow staring back at me. I yelped in shock. The tumbler fell from my suddenly weakened grip and shattered on the floor. My face went flush, and I felt incredibly dizzy and sick. When the vision did pass, all I saw was Captain McPhail staring at me with a curious hatred.
You're not right, boy,
he snarled while frowning. So I saw it as my cue to leave. I went back to the cursed ship's own damp little corner to wait out the vengeful storm. But as I shuffled through the orlops, I felt it again. That presence. A howling groan that felt like a whisper on the back of my neck. I turned and cast my gaze back down the dim hallway and saw there was nothing there. But I knew there was. There was something old and malevolent in those seas. Whatever it was, I knew we were about to face it. I do not remember going to bed that night, only that I'd taken too much laudanum. My drug-induced sleep was rife with nightmares and terrors, yet deep and steady. I could not escape it. I only remember this vague feeling of inescapable blackness heavy against my breathing, like I was suffocating. Something about bloodied meat also. When I finally woke up, I was shocked to learn that I had been unresponsive for most of the morning. I only arose from my slumber after Mr. Cartwright had shaken me awake. The storm had worsened while I was out, and I blearily arose to my feet to find the decks in utter pandemonium. Men about me were pumping the dirty water out of the crevices of the ship. Others were heaving past me, holding ropes and tools. Before I could even comprehend where I was immediately shunted back into the cot by the violent thrashings of the storm. Rainwater spewed down from holes in the ceiling and onto my head. Laying backward and looking through the portholes, I viewed upside down the nauseating flashing of lightning and instantly understood what was happening.
You best brace yourself, Doctor,
Mr. Cartwright shouted down to me as he held firmly with both arms, lifting me back to my feet.
It's only gonna get worse.
His face was pale and washed out. He looked genuinely scared.
Where's Captain MacPhail?
I asked, coughing out wads of old spit and phlegm onto the floor.
At the wheel. We need to steer out of this storm.
I eventually mustered enough strength to lunge up to the decks and meet the captain. He was frantic and terrified also. He was up there, wrestling the wheel away from the waves. He fought against the rain and gnawing winds lashing at his face. I staggered over to him, slamming into ropes and railings as I did. Glancing off the port side, I saw the waves roar immensely into sickening peaks of gray and white, and the thrashing of heavy rain hammering down all around. Everything was blurring into an inconceivable, fathomless smudge of gray, completely indistinguishable from each other. It made my head swim.
Captain!
I shouted.
Leave me! We need to get out of this storm!
Captain MacPhail screamed at me as I accosted him.
We're in a whirlpool! We can't let loose! Every time it turned off, the tides turn against me! We're stuck! Can we not anchor and weigh it out?
I asked.
The anchor will rip the bow right off the front of the ship. I can't see anything. The compass has ceased to work. What?
I barked back, unsure whether I had heard him clearly against the lament of the cyclone.
The compass does not work! It pointed in this direction, and now we're lost. It just spins around and around now.
He screamed while pointing at it. When I heard those words, coupled with the interminable storm, I felt something thick and squelching drop in my chest. The ship banked sharply from port to starboard, and I felt pulled down a swirling plug hole. We were deep in the maelstrom of a horrible churning mass of water, lightning, and wind. The shouting all around was disorienting me, and soon my vision blurred. I remember heaving up a great mess of vomit onto the deck. I felt so weak that I could scarcely fight against the expansive pounding seas. I soon resigned myself to huddling in a cubbyhole underneath the mid-deck. I pulled my knees up to my chest and hugged them to keep the warmth in my body. Then I buried my head into my jerkin to create a semi-waterproof shell against the torrents. It did not work. Icy water seeped in everywhere, and soon my whole body felt damp, shivering, and tingly. I was so disoriented and tired that all I could do was sit there in the downpour and feel sorry for myself, mumbling various prayers ad nauseum. At some point, the ship banked sharply, and I slammed my head against the stairwell wall. It stunned me completely, and I couldn't focus on much else. The ordeal went on. The tempest was relentless. We could not fathom night from day in the purest of darkness. I could not say for certain how long the storm raged. I only knew that the ship would not survive much longer against the arcs of nature. But the night did mercifully fall at some point, and the storm fell with it. It retreated silently up into the suddenly vacuous, dark sky without announcement. Not that we acknowledged that. Most of the battle-exhausted men simply slept where they fell. The ship fell silent too, its masts downed like fallen pine trees across the deck. And the wreck of the SS Glenmore drifted on listlessly through the unknown fogs and flat, waveless seas. I lay still under the stairs. Nothing about me moved. Everything was just silent. With the silence, I suffered my second nightmare-filled sleep aboard the ship. I had dreams of blinding white light, and did not stop for a very long time. Chapter 4. Vaticinium ex eventu. The switch happened as we slept. No one heard it. No one remembered it. None of them saw a thing. We all woke up slowly, either the next morning or the morning after that. I'm not sure which. All of us were unsure where we were. Dates and times were lost. Everyone about the decks was groggy and somber. One by one, they rose to their feet in the endless fog. Some wandered around the middeck without guidance, as if they had forgotten who they were. I woke up shivering in a puddle of my own vomit. Wearily, I leaned against the balustrade of the stairs and checked myself. I had a large cut across my forehead that required stitching at some point, but at this moment it had ceased bleeding, so I left it and stood up to find the captain, heading past all the tattered men as I did.
Anyone has dreams of flashing white lights?
Harper fearfully asked the crew around him. I bowed my head as I moved past him, pretending I didn't hear the question that made my head fill with terror.
Yeah,
someone said, nodding slowly.
Me too,
Chamberlain retorted solemnly also.
What is this? All this fog?
Harper then asked while looking around vacantly. Captain MacPhail had draped his fatigued body over the wheel on the bridge. He had threaded his arms through it and clasped his hands together, hugging the ship desperately, as if saying his final goodbyes to a dying and loyal pet. He looked like a man who had truly been defeated. I made a half-hearted attempt to appear upbeat and then cautiously approached him. He did not respond as I came up onto the bridge next to him. Instead, he resigned himself to staring vacantly down the ship's length at all his rugged and bloodied men. Some were still picking themselves up out of the puddles they had passed out in. The ship seemed not to be rocking on the waves anymore, and I didn't know why.
Hell of a storm, Captain,
I said. There was no reply from him.
What shall we do?
I asked hesitantly.
Nothing,
he replied after a short pause. I did not understand initially. We were surrounded by this white, enveloping fog, unlike any I had seen before. The haunting winds drifted quietly around the dead ship as if like a ghostly specter filtering through forgotten wreckage. Nothing? I don't understand, I said. We can't do anything now. The salty ditch with all of us. Right, Doctor? He chided. What do you mean? The rudder's broken, he replied in a flat hoarse tone. The engine is flooded. The masts are destroyed. We're a wreck. I breathed out heavily and observed the damage on the ship. Is there no way to repair it? He simply shook his head and buried it deeper into his arms. No. I sighed heavily at the news and could do nothing else but stand there looking at my feet. Captain McPhail rubbed his furrowed brow and spat out a wad of tobacco. Why does it even fucking matter anyway? He growled. We've done nothing wrong, but still, this happens. You stick your head out of the gutter for one lousy moment and fate shovels shit right into your mouth. Fuck it all. I bowed my head apologetically and moved away from him. I went and sat near the mizzenmast and could only look at the floor, feeling utterly distraught. Everyone else aboard was the same. They all sat and bowed their furrowed brows. After some time, the fog began to clear, and I heard someone exclaim, My God, what is that? It was Simmons, the cabin boy. He was pointing upwards at the mist behind the Captain McPhail. We all turned to face what the lad was pointing at. Then, one by one, we saw it. I saw land for the first time in almost 2 weeks, and it was not a welcomed sight. Looming up out of the clearing fog was a stark and jagged cliff face that seemed to have risen up impossibly out of the sea, as if the ocean floor itself had been jutted up in a primal volcanic blast. When my gaze fell upon the dizzying wall of stone, my blood ran cold, and I reeled back, feeling as if I were about to pass out. We had run aground. We all stood utterly awestruck and horrified by the mist-capped monstrous cliff of unknown legions that seemingly arose from nowhere. This iron-gray spiked wall loomed closer out of the mist. The cliffs meandered off into gray fog in both directions. Back out to sea, and just off the main bulk of the island, was a rocky pinnacle that sat out on its own in the water like an ancient buoy. Had this island always been there? Was it always hidden behind this wall of fog? Or had we crossed over into something else? My mind ran away with me, and I believed all the possibilities to be true for a moment each. At some point during our lull, the ship must have been heaved up onto the rocky outcrop by the tides. The SS Glenmore had crumpled slowly and unregistered against the side of this alien cliff like a can of potted meat. Water had poured into the bilge below and acted as dead weight. Like the culmination of our punishment, we were suddenly stranded on this barren, unknown rock in the middle of the ocean. I closed my eyes and begged for it all to be a nightmare that I was about to wake up from. But it didn't happen. I pleaded to find myself back in bed, bolting up in a cold sweat from this horrific dream.
Chilling tales for dark nights.